Hi, everyone. Welcome. You are welcome to turn on your cameras if you want. We'd love to see your faces as you're listening. And I want to thank you all for joining this morning. We are thrilled to have such a wonderful program for our Center for Jewish Living and Learning. We try and bring in a variety of speakers and a variety of people to offer different perspectives. And we are so thrilled to have a program today with Israeli journalist Haviv Ger. And as you all know, Israel is having an election coming up soon, their fourth in 2 years. And we've all been in a crazy political climate lately, and so has Israel. And I'm so excited that Haviv will be here to give perspective on what got Israel to this point and really where we go from here. So a little bit about him before I turn it over. Haviv is a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as a senior analyst at the Times of Israel. He's covered Israeli politics and the country's foreign and regional policies, as well as its relationship with the Jewish diaspora since 2005. He's reported from over 20 countries, is fluent in Hebrew and English, and lectures in Israel and all around. He served as the director of communications for the Jewish Agency for Israel and has also taught history and politics. So he is the perfect person to give us some perspective on this. I know that he has also met with our JCC staff when they've traveled to Israel to have conversations with them as well. So thank you, Haviv. Before we turn it over, he's going to give us a really good overview, and then there will be time for a question and answer after the fact. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. They will go only to me, and then I will ask the questions. So as you think of questions, go on ahead and type them so that you don't forget, and then I can go back and filter them out during the conversation piece. So again, please turn on your computers so Haviv isn't, or turn on your screens so Haviv isn't just looking at everyone's names. And I'm thrilled to turn it over to you. So welcome all the way from Jerusalem. Or not Jerusalem? Yes.
Yes. Hello, everybody. How are things? A strange question to be asking in these times. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to run through a bit of a complicated argument that I want to make, and then we'll open it up for just a conversation. And I want to make an argument that's not usually heard about Israel, because a lot of times the debates around Israel, around Israeli elections, around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, around now the vaccination drive, all the sort of discourse that we're used to about Israel in the news in the United States and around the world, misses a lot of the reality on the ground, not in the sense that people don't necessarily know what's happening or don't have access to Israeli news. There's a tremendous amount of English language news coming out of Israel, but in the sense that Israel's a very strange society. It's a very different place. It's made up of very different cultures than make up, for example, American Jews, than produced American Jews, and the American Jewish cultural experience of the last century and a half. And so a lot of things, even though we share a vocabulary, we all have the word Jew, we all use the word community, we all use the word rabbi, we all use all these words that are part of the Jewish experience, we mean very different things a lot of the times, and we miss a lot of the sort of experiences in the conversation. So what I want to do is I want to tackle Israeli, we're 9 days to an Israeli election. It's the fourth election in 2 years. This is the very first time we have experienced anything like this in Israel's history. In April of 2019, there was an Israeli election, and it took the various parties that got elected about 6 weeks, or I guess it was more closer to 8 weeks, by May 30, from April 9 to May 30, they were negotiating a new coalition government. And then on May 30, which for various reasons that don't matter for this conversation, is the legal deadline for either submitting a government to the parliament or Benjamin Netanyahu losing the right to form a government and possibly also going to a new election. May 30 was the deadline for all those things. And by May 30, the parties in the parliament had failed to produce a government. Now, May 30, 2019 was the first time in the history of Israel that we had an election that did not end in a government, that we didn't actually manage to elect anyone after voting for the parties that we vote for in parliament. And that started this insane 2 years of political deadlock, of dysfunction. We are running without a state budget since the beginning of 2020. We are a year and 3 months without a state budget. Reforms, major reforms, major strategic, railway lines down south and hospital budgets for next year and all kinds of really, really important basic things having to do with the functioning of the country are not happening and aren't being delivered for us by our political class, by our politicians, by our parliament, by our government, because of this strange political deadlock, because of this run of 4 elections in 2 years. So we're now 9 days from the 4th election, and the good news is that's only 9 days, and then it's over. The bad news is that the current polls suggest that a 5th election is very likely. It might not be the most likely, but it's in the top 3 likely outcomes of this extremely, extremely close election. And so these 2 years of dysfunction, of insanity, of our system not working properly, has led to a lot of questions about Israel's electoral system, Israel's democracy. How does it work? Why is it so chaotic? Why is it so dysfunctional? And by the way, how does the country manage to succeed and thrive and prosper with a political system that is so dysfunctional? The last 2 years are an extreme example of our politics not working, but it's not a new phenomenon, which is to say we have Benjamin Netanyahu at this moment leads the 35th government of Israel. 35th government in 72 years. Our governments are elected on paper to 4-year terms and in practice serve 2-year terms. They fall early. Our parliaments, almost all of them are disbanded, dissolved early to early elections. Very, very rarely do Israelis go to vote on the actual 4-year cycle written in law. It's almost always beforehand. It's very similar, by the way, to Italy, where you have a government every, in the bad times every 8 months and in the good times every 2 years. So this is something that's been true throughout Israel's history. And I want to, instead of telling you, Benjamin Netanyahu has this chance of having a coalition with those 2 parties and Yair Lapid has the other chance of having the opposition leader of forming a coalition with the other 2 parties, and in this 11-way chess game that everybody plays in Israeli coalition politics, here's what I think are the 2 most likely options, which is something that I do for a living, and I'm happy to talk about that in the next part of this discussion. But right now, I want to tell you something a little more important, a little deeper. I want to suggest that there's a reason that Israel is both unbelievably hard, unbelievably bad at politics, at stable politics, at stable government, and also very, very successful and democratic, and successful in all kinds of economic ways and military and in the actual building of democratic institutions, even though it has such a unstable system. So we're going to answer the question that's going to tackle all of the things I just said and tie it up in a pink little ribbon at the end, and it will make sense. The fundamental, basic, underlying question that we're going to answer today is what Israeli elections are actually about. Why does almost exactly half the country want Benjamin Netanyahu to be prime minister? And why does almost exactly half the country desperately not want Benjamin Netanyahu to be prime minister? And why are they so deadlocked? And why can't they form a coalition to just make a decision already and end these endless elections? And it boils down to something very profound in Israeli society and in the structure of Israeli society and how Israelis think about their politics. That is our subject today. I'm going to start with a very, very quick overview of the surprising things about Israeli democracy that maybe you don't know, because why would they come up in a discussion on Israel? Israel is, let me just preface everything I'm about to say, which is all the problems with Israeli democracy, and there are many. Israel is an unbelievably thriving, successful, functional, liberal democracy. It has gay pride parades. It has in major metropolitan areas. It has complete freedom of speech. It has complete freedom of religion. It has complete freedom of just about anything. Gays have had the rights of marriage, not calling it marriage, but rights to adopt children together, rights to make end-of-life decisions together, rights to sue each other for alimony. In other words, the rights of marriage has been available to the gay community basically in Israel since the 90s, and we live very free lives. I want to say that, because I'm about to say all the ways in which that's not entirely the story. That's not all the story. And for that, I'm going to try and share my screen. Bear with me for a second. I brought slides, which will, of course, make everything completely confusing. And now I'm just going to launch the thing. Everybody see it? Everybody with me?
Almost.
Everybody see?
There we go. You got it.
Oh, okay. Zoom.
Oh.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Let me. Yeah, we're good.
You're showing your whole laptop though, not just the screenshot. Like we're seeing all of the slides on the left side.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, you should be able to share.
Share, annotate, remote control. Where does it let you decide what you're sharing? In other words, you see the next slide that says government system also? Gotcha. Display setting, swap presenter, and slideshow. How about now?
I don't think that you're
the same.
I think you're fine. If you look up on in your PowerPoint if you look up in the top right, it should say share. You should be able to share. Yep, there you go. Perfect. Oh, you're on mute though. Oh.
Okay. All right. We march on no matter what. The roots of Israeli democracy. Folks, Israel has one of the simplest electoral systems in the world. It is so simple that there's almost nothing to tell you about it. The entire country, when we go to vote, is a single constituency. This is a very important thing to understand. We don't have the kind of division by population that you have for the House, the state level, the federal level. We don't have, then a different division of land for the Senate, and then the presidential system through the Electoral College is also state system, but they're all different schedules. We don't have any of that complexity. We don't have any of those institutions. We have one simple election, and you walk into the voting booth and you can vote for exactly one thing, and that is a political party. It is a nationwide list, a nationwide constituency, a single constituency. You walk into the voting booth, you pick your party, the carbon copy of exactly what those votes say in terms of parties. Whichever party passes the 3.25% vote threshold gets at least 3.25% of the votes, they get into the Knesset, and they all divide the seats, the 120 seats, by how many votes you got, and that's it. We have a national party list system. Most parties don't have primaries. Parties can have primaries, and they can choose not to have primaries. Most members of Knesset are not elected by the party membership. They're elected by the leader. On the center, on the left, on the right, the ultra-Orthodox, the secularists. That's true across the board of Israeli politics. And what that means is, unlike a member of Congress in the US, who has a specific constituency, and you know who your member of Congress is, and you can write them a letter, and you can complain to them, and you can ask them for help getting a passport quickly out of the State Department. Israel's members of Knesset owe their allegiance to the party leader, and the party leader then has to grow their power by catering to their constituents in the country. These national lists where we don't even select many of the MKs. We have a unicameral system. We don't have two houses of parliament. Now, we also have one of the smallest parliaments in the world. 120 for about 8 million people, or 9 million people, is very, very small. Similar sized countries like Austria, Belgium is already 50% more population, but per capita, they have much, much larger parliaments. They have two houses of parliament. We have one of the simplest systems in the world. The prime minister by law has to be a member of the parliament. And very rarely, and never for very long, the government can survive without a majority in parliament. The vast majority of the time, it must have a majority in parliament by definition, or it can't be the government. It can't serve as the government. And what that means is we also, not only do we have a single constituency, most MKs don't represent specific people that they know who they are. They're party lists selected by a party list vote. And not only do we have a single parliament, but the government and the parliament are functionally almost the same institution. They're almost the same people. We have a very powerful high court, but its powers aren't written in any constitution, and it is one of the most powerful courts in the world, but it's a major debate that we're having in our politics over whether the court is too powerful or not powerful enough. Long story short, all of that gobbledygook was just to say, we have a political system with no checks and balances. If the prime minister, who automatically has a parliamentary majority, decides to oppress the minorities in this country, the Arabs, the Druze, whatever minorities, there are several minorities in this country. If a Jewish prime minister decides to oppress those minorities, who stops him? What institution comes into play that prevents that from happening? We are one of the simplest systems in the world, to the point where we don't have checks and balances and separation of powers in the most basic sense that you think of in the English-speaking world, in France and places like that. This is a Hebrew text. It is a press release by the Knesset, and the date is the 29th of May 2017 at 6:10 p.m. On the 29th of May 2017 at 6:10 p.m., Israel, for the very first time, canceled the 1933 Press Ordinance. The 1933 Press Ordinance was passed by the British Mandatory Government, the British Imperial Administration here, and it allowed the government to shut down any newspaper for almost any reason. Under law, we have not in Israel had a right to a free press. In 2017, the Knesset noticed. Until 2017, nobody noticed. I have been a journalist in Israel since 2005. We're very, very free to write anything we want. There are certain questions of military secrets where we have to submit it to a military censor. Everything else is wide open and you can say whatever you want. But there's no law guaranteeing it. And that's something very interesting and important to understand about Israel, because we have a free press, but we don't have a legal right to a free press written in any law. We don't have a law guaranteeing freedom of speech. We don't have a law guaranteeing equality. We don't have a law guaranteeing freedom of religion. And again, I started by saying we have these things, but we don't have laws guaranteeing them. We don't have them because of law. We also don't have a democratic tradition. And this is hard for people to get their minds around, especially when they come from, for example, America, where a lot of the discussion about Israel is a discussion that comes from American Jews. And it's obvious why American Jews see Israel, essentially demographically, American Jews are the vast majority of the Jews not in Israel. And Israel, and if you're Israeli, almost all the Jews who are not Israeli are American Jews. In other words, American Jews are something like 80% of the diaspora. Israel is something like 80% of the rest of the Jews of the world, if you're an American. These are the two communities with millions and millions of Jews in them. And everywhere else in the world put together is maybe 1.5 million Jews. So there are about 6 million in the United States, 6 million in Israel, and then 1 million, 1.5 million put together everywhere else in the world. American Jews think about Israeli Jews because they're the other half of the Jewish people. That makes sense. But then they talk about Israeli Jews as if they're very American and have an American experience. And so, for example, one of the big questions that American Jews never ask about Israelis is, why is Israel a democracy in the first place? American Jews come to America, experience the immigrant experience in America. It makes them kind of liberal for the same reason in the United States that, frankly, a lot of ethnic groups are liberal. A lot of immigrant ethnic groups are liberal, like it's from Italians to Latinos today. Even if they come in with culturally conservative ideas, they become liberal in their politics, a lot because of the experience of immigration. Israelis come from very different places and came to a very different experience. So they came from places like Iraq and Poland. These are the major waves of Jewish immigration. And Russia, by the way, Tsarist Russia, Iraq, when it was either during or immediately after a Nazi allied administration, Morocco, Yemen. We're talking about immigrant societies coming from, we're talking about a society established by immigrants who came from non-democratic places and never really had the English-speaking, the 800-year tradition of English democracy to build on, didn't have any of the liberal traditions of liberal Europe. Almost no Israeli Jews, and certainly not Israeli Arabs, who were under the Ottoman rule and then under British imperial rule and then under Israeli rule, right? So there was no moment where almost any Israeli ever experienced democracy until they landed in Israel. At some point in this conversation, I'm going to ask Yuval where her roots are. I don't know if she can hear us.
Yes, so
Yuval,
I'm half Yemenite, half Indian. My father was born in India. He was born in Bombay, and my grandparents from my mother's side were born in Yemen.
Okay, so the Yemeni side has no experience of democracy. The Indian side has an experience of democracy, but by the way, fairly recent. In other words, an Indian democracy was born the same year that Israeli democracy was born. That's all Israelis. That's Russian Israelis. They came from the Soviet Union. They did not come from a democratic Russia. That is all Israeli Jews. The first time that the vast majority of Israelis ever voted was in an Israeli election. So where do Israeli elections come from? There isn't a democratic tradition. We don't have a Bill of Rights that gives us basic rights, like freedom of religion is not written in any law in Israel. And we don't have institutions that separate and check the various powers of government. And we don't have a democratic tradition that anybody can point to. You don't have a Philadelphia Convention at the founding of Israel where founders of the country sat down and discussed how the system should look. We have the simplest electoral system in the entire free world. And the Zionist thinkers thing that you'll see on the slide, I'm going to ignore for a moment, but it makes a lot of sense to Israelis who go through Israeli schooling, where the curriculum is about, there's about 24 famous and important Jewish thinkers of the Zionist movement who helped establish Israel and set the tone for Israel and establish the institutions of Israel. And when you look at their thinking, these are the founders of Israel, you don't see any discussion about democracy. Very little bits around the edges. It's all about socialism, and it's all about capitalism, and it's all about nationalism, and it's all about what happens if we have to fight with the Arab armies, and how do we make peace with the Arab armies. It's all about those kinds of discussions, and it has nothing to, there's almost no discussion of democracy. And now I want to end my long talk with my point. And the point is the most important thing you need to know about Israel, about Israeli democracy, and it is what Israeli elections are about. It's where Israeli democracy comes from. It's how Israeli society works. The Great Standoff. This is a painting of the Magna Carta signing. The man sitting is King John of England. This is 1215. The nobles around him are not his friends. The nobles around him are the leaders of the army assembled in the background, and they have just defeated John's armies, and they are forcing him to sign a document. Now, in his tome, which is actually very readable and fun even, and very historical, but nevertheless it is a little long, Francis Fukuyama has this 2-volume history of the origins of political order. And somewhere around the middle or end of volume 1, he makes an argument about the Magna Carta that I found very profound as an Israeli, because it offered me a way to talk in English about the roots of Israeli democracy. He says the following about the signing of the Magna Carta. He says something very special happened, because if you actually read the Magna Carta, there's not a lot in there that should have produced an 800-year liberalization of the English-speaking world toward the modern liberal democracies we have today. It's basically just, I, the king, can't just impose my will on the nobles without asking them. I can't take all their money. I can't kill them randomly. It's some rights that he essentially gives to nobles because those nobles are able to defeat him in battle. That's all it is. It could also have been a blip, and everything had continued, with the same monarchies that there'd been before, as things continued in other parts of the world. Why did the Magna Carta produce a slow, centuries-long, piece-by-piece liberalization that gave us today's modern democracy, at least the English-speaking version, which is the powerful and sort of tone-setting democratic tradition in the world? Why did that happen? And Fukuyama's argument is very simple. The king ruled London, and London was very powerful in 1215, just like it's powerful today. It's very powerful also financially. It's a trade center. It could raise armies. It could raise vast money. Whoever rules London can raise armies forever. The nobles, however, in England, unlike in other parts of Europe, unlike in France, unlike in what would later become Germany, the nobles in England were very, very local nobles. They spoke the local dialects of their small towns, of their shires, of their areas. They had the loyalty of their people in those areas. England never centralized around a monarchy in the way that France did. And so nobles also had the loyalty of their own people out in the sticks, in Yorkshire or Nottinghamshire or wherever, and could raise their own armies. If the nobles united, they could face down the monarchy in London. Now, why are we taking a tangent off to the monarchy in London? By the way, this happened a dozen times in English history. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution with William and Mary, the Wars of the Roses. These are all unions of nobles of fighting over a crown. The crown itself is very powerful because it controls London. And Fukuyama's point was that the Magna Carta itself didn't give England its democracy, not the document. The document is what kids learn in school, but the document isn't what's important. What gave the English their democracy was the simple fact that the king could never be defeated. Once the English cut off the head of the king, and guess what? Then they had to deal with the next king. The king, as an institution, as a power base, couldn't be defeated. And the kings discovered over the centuries that the nobility couldn't be defeated. And so they established for the nobility a parliament, and that parliament slowly opens its doors to the very wealthy traders, and the very wealthy traders slowly agree to let slightly less wealthy merchants into parliament. And the whole thing slowly expands until in the last 100 years, of course, it's everybody, women and minorities, and there aren't any limits anymore. And democracy is liberal in the sense that we understand it today. What gave the English their democracy was the Great Standoff between a social reality of London being powerful and the king in London being powerful in ways that you couldn't just defeat him in battle because there'd always be the next king. There are fundamental social realities that you could not fight. and nobles who also had power that could never be fully defeated because of a social reality of this very localized society and localized social hierarchy. And that standoff in 1215 at sword point, literally at sword point, that standoff was rooted in powerful, deep social truths. And around the standoff, the English started building their institutions of democracy, like Parliament and a House of Lords, and all the other traditions that are English democracy, and later British democracy. If you are a tourist to England today, from a place like Israel or a place like France or even the United States, and you see a procession of the royal family in the street, it's a very strange thing if you think about it, because it is in the Middle East, we have a lot of dictators who pretend to be Democrats, who pretend to be liberal Democrats. Like Bashar Assad claims he's elected, and he keeps holding elections to prove that he's elected. In England, you have a liberal democracy pretending to be a dictator. On paper, the Queen is a dictator. And so Fukuyama explains that the reason that the British have this game called the monarchy, that everybody understands isn't real, is because it is one of the building blocks of their democracy. The king was part of the building of the democracy because the democracy is the institutions built around that standoff. That's the argument. Welcome to Israel. We don't have a king and a nobility and that standoff. We have a different great standoff. Israeli society is one of the most fractured into tribally, culturally, religiously, socially, ethnically, and that's just the Jews. Never mind the great divide between Jews and Arabs, and the enormous, enormous divides among Arab Israelis, between the very conservative Muslim Islamist Bedouin in the south, who are also polygamists and extremely traditionalist in terms of their culture and Islam and views on gender, and the progressive, highly educated doctors and lawyers of Haifa in the Arab community, who put it this way, a Haifa doctor among the Arabs is someone I live in the same world with, and they vote together. Bedouin in the south of Israel, who they're closer to me than they are to each other. In other words, the cultures among the Arabs are just as widely divergent as the cultures among the Jews. There are many, many, many tribes in Israel on both sides of the ethnic divide, many, many more tribes and many, many more profound and important divides than sort of make the news cycle, right? We are a country built by immigration waves. We are a country based on ethnic identities and the gaps between our ethnic identities. The Haredim in Israel, the ultra-Orthodox, are a tribe. They vote for their own parties. The religious Zionists are the modern Orthodox with certain ways of thinking and certain lifestyles. By the way, we generally live apart. Most ultra-Orthodox live in their own towns and their own neighborhoods, and secularists live in their towns and neighborhoods, and the religious Zionists in their neighborhoods. The divide between Sephardi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews is still enormous. And that's strange because most Israelis are already intermarried. Most Israeli Jews are already half Sephardi, a quarter Ashkenazi, they're already a mix. But they still identify as one or the other, and that divide is very important. Benjamin Netanyahu wins the Sephardi vote, the vote of Israeli Jews who came from the Arab world. So their grandkids are now my age. Benjamin Netanyahu wins them about 70-30. And Yair Lapid's voters, who is the opposition leader challenging Netanyahu, he wins the Ashkenazim, the Jews of European extraction, 70-30. In other words, the divide is very, very much along those lines. Why does Israel have this unbelievably simple electoral system to the point where we don't have checks and balances? Why do we have a national party list? I'm already over my time, so I'm winding down. This is the end. Why do we have a national list system where you just walk into a voting booth and pick a party out of about 35 parties running, and about 11 make it in, and then the parties go off to form a coalition in negotiations? because those party lists reflect the tribes, the real tribes that are the foundation of how Israelis live and think and feel, both about their politics, but also just in their daily lives. I am not just Israeli. I belong to one of the tribes in Israel, whether that's Ashkenazi or secular. By the way, I'm not secular. I'm actually pretty observant, but I belong to the secular tribe. I personally, because of the sort of expectations and lifestyle, and I'm not saying anything about my voting pattern. I, of course, am an objective journalist, but we are a country of tribes. And one of the more important facts you need to know about Israelis is that no one party, no one tribe represented by any one party, not the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox of the Shas party, and not the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox of the United Torah Judaism party. The ultra-Orthodox in Israel are divided on the Ashkenazi-Sephardi divide, and the ultra-Orthodox divide themselves from the modern Orthodox, and those are different political parties. And the modern Orthodox and the secular, those are different political parties. And recently, by the way, we've seen liberal Jews, Reform Jews, for example, caucusing with the Labor Party, which is, again, a tribal decision in terms of how Israeli society functions. No one party and no three parties have ever had a majority in the history of Israel. And so elections in Israel aren't decided on election day. We don't come away from election day with a president. Elections are decided in the weeks and sometimes up to 3 months after election day, when whatever tribal, mirror of Israeli society Israelis send to parliament hammers out a coalition that has enough of a majority. In the last government, it was 5 or 6 parties, to actually run the country and to win a majority vote in parliament for the state budget. We have one institution in Israel, and it has given us a democracy. Without rights, without checks and balances, without separation of powers, again, officially, without any of those things officially. And that institution is the coalition negotiating table between different tribes that all come to the table and negotiate for each other. It's in the government negotiating at the coalition negotiating table to form a government that the ultra-Orthodox extract for their institutions state funding and can run their own independent school systems. You want to know how powerful our tribes are and our tribal structures are? They change the school system you go to. There's an ultra-Orthodox school system or several. There is a religious Zionist school system with a separate group of schools and separate principles and a separate state curriculum. There is a secular, there is an Arab school system. These are separate school systems. That's what we vote on. We vote our tribes. And we vote our sub-tribes, the little bits of tribes that sometimes separate from a tribe and cling to another tribe, like the Ra'am party, which split from the larger coalition of Arab parties and is now running separately. It's a group of Arabs, by the way, represents the Negev Bedouin, the very conservative Muslim Negev Bedouin, who split from the more liberal Arab community and is running as a separate party in the current election, unlike the last 3 elections when they ran together. We have in Israel the strangest of democracies, if you're looking at it from the West. It is a democracy based on tribes. And because no tribe is the majority, and no tribe has ever been a majority, not since the founding of the state, David Ben-Gurion, for all that he ruled this country and was the great, the old man, they called him in his day, back in the 40s and 50s, and is unassailable and you couldn't vote him out of office, he never had a parliamentary majority without having to make coalition agreements with others. Israeli elections are about those tribes. Benjamin Netanyahu's problem over 4 elections in which he has been unable so far to get a majority is that the tribes are divided on him. The social groups are divided on him. He is winning, landslides among certain social categories, cultural categories, religious categories, among the ultra-Orthodox, among the Mizrahim. And he is losing by an opposite landslide. Is it a landslide if you're losing? Among the other social constituencies and tribes. That's what Israeli politics are about. And one last sentence. If you go to Lebanon, that's how Lebanese politics work. What matters in your politics is not what you think about the economy and not what you think about healthcare, not what you think about abortions. And I don't know exactly what divides Americans today around, Biden and the Trump period. It's gotten confusing for outsiders looking in, but those culture wars and those substantive divides on policy, those are not what divides you in Lebanon. Whether you're Shia or Sunni or Christian or Maronite Christian or Druze, decides your vote. That's how it works in Syria. The civil war in Syria is an Alawite war against the Sunnis. That is a war of tribes. That's how it works in Iraq. After the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it tried to create a constitution for Iraq. It had an American professor, write a constitution. And for some magical reason, it didn't work. Because the Iraqi society and what Iraqis actually did with their government was build a government that is a kind of difficult and hard to manage coalition of Kurd, Sunni, and Shia. Israel, folks, half of Israeli Jews come from the Middle East. We built a democracy rooted in this tribal standoff that the institutions we built around it, mainly the coalition negotiating table, is the source of our democracy. Do you know why we have gay marriage since the 90s? Even though not only do we not have gay marriage, you might know, folks, because you might be familiar with Israel and Israeli law, and we don't actually have civil marriage. You can only marry in the Israeli state-recognized rabbinate. And because we don't have civil marriage, that's a concession to the ultra-Orthodox, we also, as a concession to the secularists, have all marriage of everyone, anywhere, any kind through this institution that's essentially common law marriage. That's what the English call it. We call it Yiduim B'tzibur. It's an old Talmudic idea of if you share a home and a bed together and your finances together, you're married, mazal tov, right? So through that institution, a gay couple is able to sue each other for alimony when they break up since the 90s. In the last, 8 years, the Western world has all passed laws creating official gay marriage and opening up the gates of that whole issue. And now Israel's at the back of the line in the developed world in terms of rights and in terms of openness. But until then, it was at the front of the line. And it was at the front of the line even though an official law, on paper, Israel's actual marriage law officially is basically the Middle East, is basically Lebanon's. I'm going to stop there. I talked way too long. Welcome to Israel. It's a strange place. Before you are sure you know what you're talking about with Israel, and Americans talk about Israel a lot, and we have this unbelievably strong alliance, and half the Jews of the world live in Israel, and the other half live in America. So the fact that that bridge is vital to both countries is obvious. But somehow, even though we share words, we share a vocabulary, we don't share what they mean, what the words mean. We don't share a lot of the basic sort of assumptions. American Jews are first of all, they're almost entirely from European extraction. They have spent 100 and 150 years in the United States. They are acculturated, and they have a lot of assumptions that are very American assumptions, which are fantastic. Israelis are not more authentic or more, Israeli Jews have changed everything as well about what being Jewish means, but in a very different direction. And so they no longer really know how to hear each other and how to understand the things that they're missing in the conversation, because they're things we don't talk about. The biggest things in our lives, in our cultures, in our politics, are often things we don't talk about. Welcome to a democracy born in tribe and solidarity, and without any of the institutions that an American high school education tells you are necessary for creating democracy. If there is an Arab democracy in the Arab world over the next 10 years or 30 years, it'll look like Israel. It'll look tribal. It won't have a law giving freedom of the press. It'll just have a basic cultural assumption and social assumption that nobody can shut up anybody else, because if you start shutting each other up, it ends badly. And every time the Israeli right tries to pass a law that the Arabs don't like, the Arabs go to the ultra-Orthodox who team up with the Arabs against the Israeli Jewish right. It's how those tribes work and keep the open space. I don't know if Israeli democracy is stronger because it's based on these sort of social realities rather than constitutions and top-down theory and institutions. I don't know if it's weaker. I know that there are countries in the world with beautiful constitutions that are dictatorships. Iran has all the rights in law that Israel doesn't. Every single human alive, given the choice between being under the current Iranian regime and being under the current Israeli regime, I think would prefer the Israeli. I don't have good answers for beyond what I've said, but that's what Israeli elections are about. They're about those tribes. I'm going to shut up. I'm expecting Israelis to tell me to shut up at this point, but all I have is polite.
Well, then I'll be that Israeli.
Oh, thank you.
No, I had to wait. I had to be my polite American first. But now, first of all, thank you. This was fascinating. I know I've lived in Israel. I've learned about Israeli politics. I know so much. And this was an entirely new perspective. So thank you for really kind of giving that big picture. And now I would love to open it up to questions. If you'd like, you can type your questions in the chat box. I think we're a small enough group if you want to turn on your camera and ask a question. We have one right here from Barbara Lapidus. So you said that Israel has freedom of religion, yet Reform and conservative Jews must be married, and I think buried by Orthodox rabbis in law. Please explain, and are there schools where Arab and Jewish children go together?
Right. So the freedom of religion point is exactly what I'm talking about. On paper, Israel does not have freedom of religion, not even close. It doesn't claim to have freedom of religion. On paper, it explicitly restricts religion. By the way, to ridiculous extents. It adopted full sort of wholesale the Ottoman millet system that the Ottoman Empire used to have its religious minorities essentially govern themselves so that the Ottomans didn't have to govern them, under which the Jews created their own little rabbinate, and the rabbinate ran the Jews. They ran family law, I mean, important things. Burial, conversion, marriage, divorce, important life cycle events. And Israel just adopted that Ottoman millet system. And so it's not just that Reform and conservative rabbis, for example, aren't recognized by the state of Israel for performing marriages. Anyone who isn't recognized by the rabbinate isn't recognized for performing marriages. Or, so for example, Orthodox rabbis. My wife is the daughter of an Orthodox rabbi. She's the oldest of 8 kids. We were married by her father, an Orthodox rabbi. There was an ultra-Orthodox member of Knesset at our wedding. But on principle, I won't let the rabbinate, I personally don't like the rabbinate, I won't let the rabbinate anywhere near my wedding. So it's not a kosher wedding for the state of Israel. We are married, according to the state of Israel, in a courthouse in Maryland. The restrictions are extreme, and incidentally, it's not just for the Jews. It's for all religions recognized by the state. The Muslims have a Sharia court system appointed, funded by the state of Israel. The Justice Minister of Israel chairs the committee to appoint the Qadis, the religious judges of the Sharia court system, the Muslim legal court system. That is the only place a Muslim can marry and divorce in the state of Israel under Israeli law. There's sometimes some anti-Israel folks like to say that Israel actually outlaws intermarriage. Israel doesn't outlaw intermarriage. Israel outsources all marriage of all kinds to official religions that it recognizes. And so that creates a very funny, very strange situation in which, for example, there is one kind of intermarriage recognized by the state of Israel officially, and that is the Sharia intermarriage. Sharia law allows for a Muslim man, only a man, to marry a monotheistic woman, Christian or Jewish, but no other women, non-Muslim women. And that form of intermarriage of a Jewish woman marrying a Muslim man is officially recognized by the state of Israel because there's a court that'll do the marriage, a Sharia court, according to Sharia law. It just adopted that old system. Now, that's the law. By the way, there are something like 400,000 Israelis who are not in any religious category recognized by the state. For example, the State of Israel doesn't recognize Protestantism. It just doesn't know it exists. And the reason the State of Israel officially doesn't know Protestant Christianity exists is that during the British Mandate, the British pulled all Protestants into the Church of England institutions in the mandatory, under its mandate, right? So then the British left, and there wasn't a Protestant religious institution that could marry. So Protestants can't marry in Israel at all. And Israel has nothing against Protestants. It's just an Ottoman system that we cannot reform because we cannot agree on what would replace it. But nobody in Israel likes. And so what has developed is this common law system, Yaduim B'tzibur. My brother is married under a common law system. He is completely married. He has all the rights of marriage, but he's not technically married according to the State of Israel, and it's not written as married. But he and his wife jointly hold custody over their children together in their home with their unified bank accounts, right? So we have no religious freedom in law, but we have all religious freedom. If you show up, the Church of Scientology has a center in Israel. You show up in Israel, you establish a religion, you walk around being that religion, mazal tov. The trick is to just not ask anybody. And that's how it's done. By the way, the reform movement in Israel has dozens of institutions, kindergartens and synagogues, and they do weddings, they do conversions, they do everything. Just, they don't ask anybody. And that's it. That's all of Israeli, that's a huge swath of Israeli society lives without the rabbinate and without any legal recognition, but with all the rights and nobody asks anybody.
So interesting.
Can I follow up with a quick question?
Please.
Yes.
What if your brother and his wife wanted to get a divorce? Who would or could do that, or would that just also be common law and hope they agree?
One of the uglier aspects of not setting the system down in an orderly fashion is that you kind of have to live with the sort of whatever happens to be the situation. There are civil family courts in Israel. There are religious family courts in Israel. And the civil family courts dealt with things that were not part of the religious law. And over the years, they became more and more powerful, mainly through court precedent. And now the situation if you're actually married in Israel and you actually are contemplating a divorce, it's the same situation every time where whichever court opens your file is the court that handles your case. And the reason that that's ugly is that men run to the rabbinate court, where they have a huge advantage on simple things. If you want a divorce because one partner cheated on the other, the evidentiary standards for a man to prove that a woman cheated is much more favorable to the man in the religious court and is much less favorable to the woman than in the civil court, where it's an equal standard, right? And the women run to the civil family court, and whichever court opens the file is the court that sees it through to the end. So it's an ugly system. That you just pointed to one of the real lacunae that we need to dramatically reform, and we can't reform because we can't agree on how to replace the court system. Nobody, by the way, the people most passionate about Jewish law running the world, the ultra-Orthodox, don't do anything with the rabbinate and don't do anything in rabbinate courts. They have their own religious court systems that they built for themselves, that they go to, that are just as informal as the reform ones. So there just isn't anyone who thinks the rabbinate's a good thing, unless Yuval does, and then there is one. But I haven't asked all Israelis, in other words. But even people who do believe very passionately in Orthodox law and Orthodox Judaism and think that should be how an Orthodox society, how a Jewish society functions, think the rabbinate is deeply in need of reform.
This is.
Thank you.
Yes. And I know that we only have a couple of minutes left. I have a question, unless someone else has another question that you'd like to share. If you do, you can ask it after this. I guess my question, here I am, a Jewish person in America. Here we are, Jewish people in America. this Israeli system is so crazy, and I think, sounds like sometimes it's even hard for Israelis to understand. What can we as American Jews do from here, either, or I guess not what can we do, but what role can we play in the election, or, how can we feel like we have a say in this country that we care so passionately about?
Yeah, well, I have to say there's a huge amount of American Jewish influence in Israel, mainly through money and advocacy.
Yeah.
So one of the most important think tanks and advocacy organizations on the Israeli right, the Tikva Fund, which is an American Jewish fund, is doing a tremendous amount of work in Israel, including funding the Kohelet Forum, which is a think tank pushing very, very conservative American Jewish ideas. And on the other side, there's exactly the same thing. The New Israel Fund is funding all kinds of advocacy groups and think tanks and programs. Part of me, the sort of native-born Jerusalemite part of me, is like, how come you guys are coming here trying to tell us how to do things? Right. And I look at American healthcare and I say, hey, maybe you should be coming here and learning how to do. No offense to anybody, but there's some things we figured out that, with all due respect, we took a bunch of Yuval backed me up here, a bunch of Tsarist Russians and Yemenites and Egyptians and Syrians, and built a democracy, so maybe, so part of me wants to say that, right, all this foreign influences, and the other part of me says, wait, the Jews should always be fighting about Israel and talking to each other and screaming at each other, and the Jewish money having an effect is the most Jewish certainly in American Jewry, which is a fundraising world, and certainly in Israel as well. So I'm very happy it happens, and sometimes I'm a little sort of annoyed by American Jews advocating in Israel, but it is there. It is there. I talk to these people all the time, and I go to the Tikva Fund things, and I talk to the New Israel Fund, and a good friend of mine is actually the head of the New Israel Fund in Israel, very, very smart guy who worked on freedom of religion issues, which I very much share with him in the past. And I talk to them a lot, and what I say to them is the same thing I've said here. Don't just copy your American ideals to Israel, because that's silly. We're a different society. There are things you don't know about us. Approach us with humility. We're not stupid. It's like we are the whole startup nation. It's not like a marketing thing. 9% of our salaried workforce are high-tech engineers. I mean, it actually is this astonishing thing that we put together. So if we can't figure out the rabbit, it's not because we're stupid. It's because something profound is happening. So learn it, right? That's something I happen to say to the left. I say other things to the right, like the healthcare thing. Yeah, so there is a lot of influence, and I would urge you to get involved. And Jews, just scream. I mean, don't let anyone tell you not to express yourself. I never met a Jew that had that problem, but I'm just saying, if you happen to be, then don't.
Well, thank you. And even in asking the question, part of me was like, wait, am I overstepping my boundary by asking how you're running your government? But at the same time, it's something that we care about too. So,
and the answer is there will be Israelis who feel that, and who cares?
Right. Such an Israeli answer, and kind of I feel like the perfect way to sum up everything that you've been talking about. There are Israelis who feel this way. Who cares? You believe what you believe. Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective, for giving us really a new and interesting, or just a fascinating way of thinking about Israel and Israeli politics. And I'll give you the last word in a moment if you'd like it, but first I want to thank everyone who joined us. We are working on all kinds of wonderful programming here at the J through the Center for Jewish Living and Learning, some around Israel, some around other topics of interest. If you have thoughts or ideas or questions or people you want to have more conversations with, please reach out to me and let me know. And thank you for joining us today. And Haviv, I'll give you one last word if you'd like it.
just one, just when you're watching this election, when you're following an English language news site coming out of Israel, listen for the tribes. They're there. The ultra-Orthodox are fighting with the Russian speakers right now. Their parties are fighting. They're screaming and shouting at each other. Those reflect real clashes with the Russians feel delegitimized and marginalized by the rabbinic institutions the ultra-Orthodox don't use, but nevertheless in power. That's what elections are really about. Huge amount of Netanyahu. If you look at Likud's video campaigns, video ads, just look at the faces of the people. They'll tend more Mizrahi. And then you look at Yair Lapid's, they'll tend more Ashkenazi. Listen for the tribes. And if you want to understand the division among the Arabs now, who are dividing up politically, it's a division about playing that coalition tribal negotiating game. If you listen about that, you will understand Israel better than all the think tanks.
Wonderful. Well,
Lauren, do you mind if I say one quick thing?
yes, of course.
Okay, so I think we've learned right now that Israel has a lot of flaws in their democratic system and government system. And talking about those flaws will get us a little bit closer to find a solution and get better in those aspects, which is great. But at the same time, I think it's important to appreciate that we got to that point, and Israel is a relatively young country. And I think it's amazing that we got to this point in so little time, So it's good to talk about the flaws, and at the same time, I think we should really appreciate how we got to this point.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Absolutely.
actually, as all of you will notice, Yuval is in her car. She is on her way back from Atlanta because she just voted in the Israeli election. You have to do it at the consulate there. So she did her duty even from here. So thank you all so much. I'm even more excited now to follow these elections and to see what happens. And everyone enjoy your Sunday, and please stay in touch. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you to Habib, who gave a wonderful talk. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
The faces of the people, they'll tend more Mizrahi. And then you look at Yair Lapid's, they'll tend more Ashkenazi. Listen for the tribes. And if you want to understand the division among the Arabs now, who are dividing up politically, it's a division about playing that coalition tribal negotiating game. If you listen about that, you will understand Israel better than all the think tanks.
Wonderful. Well,
Lauren, do you mind if I say one quick thing?
yes, of course.
Okay, so I think we've learned right now that Israel has a lot of flaws in their democratic system and government system. And talking about those flaws will get us a little bit closer to find a solution and get better in those aspects, which is great. But at the same time, I think it's important to appreciate that we got to that point, and Israel is a relatively young country. And I think it's amazing that we got to this point in so little time, So it's good to talk about the flaws, and at the same time, I think we should really appreciate how we got to this point.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Absolutely.
actually, as all of you will notice, Yuval is in her car. She is on her way back from Atlanta because she just voted in the Israeli election. You have to do it at the consulate there. So she did her duty even from here. So thank you all so much. I'm even more excited now to follow these elections and to see what happens. And everyone enjoy your Sunday, and please stay in touch. Thanks.
Thank you.